Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies that aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy related topics by inviting both scholars and practitioners to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, it gives me great pleasure to welcome an old friend, former colleague and co-author, Andy Gawthorpe, who will be speaking this evening about the continuity versus change in the so-called Imperial Presidency, with specific reference to the recent administration of Donald Trump and the current administration of Joe Biden. Having lived in the UK at the time of the transition from the George W. Bush administration to the Obama administration, I was quite struck by the degree to which perceptions of the United States shifted radically, virtually overnight. A change of leader was widely expected to lead to a change in policy, although as it turned out, there was a lot less policy change than many had hoped for. On the other hand, I suppose we can talk about a change in personality, but what about a change in external circumstances? I mean, to what extent did the end of the Cold War, which I think can be appropriately characterized as a major shift in global geopolitics, to what extent did this lead to massive changes in U.S. foreign policy or not? What do we actually mean by massive changes in foreign policy? So I think, regardless, an obvious question to ask is, what then do we actually mean by change versus continuity with respect to what sort of issues does this even apply or not apply? And are we talking about the substance of the policy, the style or manner in which the U.S. seeks to push its agenda, or something else? Now, when administrations change, is perhaps the most sensible thing to hope for the best and expect the worst. Anyway, over the course of the hour, Andy will help clear this up for us. Now, just to give a bit of background, Andy currently teaches at Leiden University, where, among other things, he runs a superb podcast called America Explained, which I'd strongly encourage all of you to follow. Having earned his BA and MA in history at Cambridge University, he then made a very sensible choice by moving to King's College London to pursue a PhD. Later, he worked as a teaching fellow at King's, which is where we became acquainted due to a mutual interest in the Vietnam War. And then he left us to go on to Harvard as a postdoctoral fellow. He's the author of To Build as Well as Destroy, American Nation Building in South Vietnam, published by Cornell University Press in 2018. He's also authored a number of journal articles, one of which I absolutely love the title. It's called Mad Dog, Samuel Huntington and the Vietnam War, published in the Journal of Strategic Studies, also in 2018. In addition to his academic publications, he also publishes regularly for the Guardian newspaper. And in his life before academia, he spent a number of years working for the UK Cabinet Office. So Andrew, welcome to eBay, virtually at least, and I look forward to your presentation, which my colleague should be loading up shortly.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeff. And yeah, it's a real honor to be here. And we were just chatting beforehand about how, one of the good side effects of the pandemic, if we can say there have been any good side effects, is how easy it is for people to get together across borders and do talks like this. And I'm so excited to be able to do this talk to the audience in Barcelona and beyond today. So thanks a lot for inviting me. So yeah, the title of my presentation today is Trump Was Not Unique, Continuity and Change in American Foreign Policy. So I'm going to talk about maybe 25 minutes or so. It would be great if anyone has any questions or comments they'd like to make, if they can put them into the chat, and then I'll be really happy to address those at the end. So this is just kind of the structure of my presentation, and I want to start by being really clear up front about what I'm saying and also what I'm not saying. Because I am trying to make kind of quite a subtle point about the Trump presidency and about American foreign policy, but I'm definitely not trying to in some way excuse or entirely normalize Trump's behavior in office. So I just want to talk about that at the beginning. Then I'm going to make two broad arguments about continuity and change in American foreign policy. One of them being about the so-called Imperial Presidency, as Jeff said at the beginning, and how Trump relates to this concept and how we can kind of understand Trump's critics, and particularly very kind of committed liberal internationalists in think tanks in the US government and US media, how we can relate them to this concept and understand the Trump era a little bit better through that. Then thirdly, I'm going to talk a little bit about Trump, Biden, and foreign economic policy and draw attention to continuities in this area between Trump and Biden. So for this talk, I kind of mashed together two projects that I'm working on at the moment, and one of which is a book about the Trump administration, and another of which is an article about Biden's foreign economic policy and its continuities with Trump. So I'm going to cover quite a lot of issues, and obviously won't be able to spend as much on them as much time on them as I would hope. So please do come at me with some questions at the end. So if I'd like you to go away from this talk with kind of one overall point that I'm making, it's that I think that the dominant frames that we use to talk about the Trump presidency, the dominant concepts that we use to talk about the Trump presidency, blind us a little bit to the continuities between him and other presidents. And I think in the heat of the moment, and I was as guilty of this as anyone else, Trump seemed to be such a kind of unique threat to America's democracy domestically, and also to some of the things that people value about American foreign policy, that I think it was at the time we perhaps exaggerated a little bit his uniqueness. So I want to just point to these continuities. And the reason that I really want to do that is because looking at these continuities, I think really turns our attention to how the certain potentialities that exist within the US Constitution, and particularly the office of the presidency, enabled Trump. And if we don't think about these potentialities, and we don't think about some of the deeper structures of American politics and foreign policy, we leave ourselves open to the return of someone like Trump or someone more dangerous than Trump. So we need to really focus on the structural factors that enabled Trump to do what he did, rather than just saying, okay, well, now Trump is gone, our problems are over. Now, what I'm not saying is that Trump was normal, or that Trump's foreign policy wasn't unusual in many different ways. I'm not saying that Trump as a person wasn't unusually incompetent and corrupt and divisive as a president. All of these things are true, but that doesn't mean that there weren't also existing alongside this these continuities that I would like to draw attention to. I'm also definitely not endorsing Trump's critiques of a so-called deep state or of the establishment, because I don't think that Trump really, Trump targeted elites in the American foreign policy establishment and in the media who were personally opposed to him and held views that he didn't like, but he didn't ultimately want to reform the structure of the American presidency and reduce the potential that exists within the American presidency for great harm to be done. He just wanted to claim that power for himself and to actually expand it in many dangerous ways. So although I will be criticizing some of the people who Trump criticized, I'm not doing it from the same standpoint that he did, and I'm not endorsing his specific critique. I'm rather saying that these elites and these commentators perhaps don't recognize the role that they played in enabling Trump. So actually, in a way, they have been and are friendly to figures like him in ways that I don't think that he necessarily realized. So yeah, just to go back to another slide on what I am saying. So like I said, a lot of what I want to accomplish is to guard against Trump or Trump-like figures in the future. And I also think that, another thing to say is that actually just our understanding of the Trump era as an episode in history is partial if we don't pay attention to these continuities that existed between Trump and previous administrations, and also exist between Trump and the Biden administration. So I think it's really important to look at him in comparative perspective, because then we not only see the ways in which he was usual, but the ways in which he was unusual, but also the ways in which he was usual. And it's only by doing that that we get a really complete understanding of the Trump era. So firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about Trump and liberal internationalism, liberal internationalists, and the Imperial Presidency. So as I'm sure you remember, Trump's victory in 2016 and then also the rest of his presidency, what happened against a background of constant censure and criticism from the people who I think we can identify as the American foreign policy establishment, or what's sometimes called the blob, after Ben Rhodes's famous phrase. So I put up here just three headlines that have really stuck with me, three articles that have really stuck with me. So Anna Applebaum in January 2017 said that Trump's election is an existential moment for the Euro-American alliance, an existential moment for the architecture of institutions that US and international laws that the US established after World War II. Joseph Nye kind of followed this up with a similar piece in Foreign Affairs, asking, will the liberal order survive? And John Aikenberry in this article that went to quite great rhetorical lengths to depict Trump as essentially kind of an enemy within. So he calls it the plot against American foreign policy, and saying that no, the liberal order was not going to survive and America itself was not going to survive because it was going to commit suicide. Trump was basically kind of like this traitor within the temple who was going to tear that whole thing down. And what we saw in this critique was that Trump was credited not just with attempting to reorient American foreign policy, but seeking the destruction of this entire thing that's called the liberal international order. And these critics come from a standpoint where they basically say that America's security and democracy is dependent on the existence of a certain type of global order, certain global rules and institutions, that favor free politics, that favor free trade, free economic exchange, that favor the existence of international institutions, and that America can only survive in a world of this nature. So if this liberal international order is torn down by someone like Trump, then America's security and prosperity will not be ensured in the future. So they're not just saying that Trump's going to change American foreign policy a little bit. They're saying that he's going to rip down the entire foundation of that foreign policy and leave America in a really, really dangerous and dark place. And of course, this line of thinking goes way back to Wilson and Wilsonianism, and so if you're familiar with that concept, this is kind of where these critics are coming from. Now, I think that if we introduce the concept of the Imperial Presidency into this conversation between Trump and his critics, then we see it in a quite different light, and we have a bit of a fresh perspective on what's going on. So just to recap for those of you who might not be familiar with the concept, the Imperial Presidency is a term that was coined by Arthur Schlesinger in this book that was published in 1974. And it basically represents the idea that the presidency as an institution has become way too powerful vis-a-vis the other branches of government, but also vis-a-vis the public. So it's become increasingly kind of undemocratic and not compatible with democratic control of foreign and security policy. And also that the president as individual has become way too powerful vis-a-vis foreign nations and governments as well, and too much destructive power has been concentrated in the hands of one individual. Schlesinger's coining of this concept, of course, comes in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, which had shown, they provided very, very strong examples of this happening recently. So, if we fast forward to the present day and we think about, well, what does this imperial presidency concept mean in the present day? It basically means that the presidency is really, really powerful vis-a-vis the government, the public, and foreign nations and other governments. So the presidency can start wars without congressional approval. It controls a large apparatus of intelligence agencies and agencies capable of covert action, which again can interfere in foreign governments and even interfere at home without congressional oversight. This apparatus is shielded from democratic scrutiny for the most part by the classification system, which actually only dates from the 1950s. The president controls nuclear weapons, and hence also potentially the fate of the whole planet rests in the hands of this one individual if they become unstable. And so if I had to identify the core of the idea of the imperial presidency, it's that basically in the modern world, which is characterized as incredibly dangerous for American security, there's a requirement to have this kind of technocratic, undemocratic concentration of power in order to be, and we have to place that concentration of power in the institution of the presidency because nobody else is capable of overseeing and protecting American security in that way. And of course, the global war on terror really supercharged this phenomenon, not only under George W. Bush and with Guantanamo Bay and the CIA black sites, but also under Barack Obama as well, right? So when Barack Obama made the decision not to close Guantanamo Bay, he made the decision to massively increase drone strikes all over the world, which is something that Trump took to an even greater extent. And Barack Obama, of course, also took this fateful decision in, well, actually, I forget the year right now, I'm afraid, but he took this decision to kill Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a US citizen, in a drone strike, and basically created this ability for the person of the president, the office of the presidency, to condemn an American citizen to death without a trial. So the imperial presidency has become very, very powerful indeed, and it's been ratified by recent presidents of both the Republican and the Democratic parties, including George W. Bush and Barack Obama. I now I'm just going to show you really quickly a 30-second TV advertisement, which was the first ever TV advertisement that Donald Trump ran in his campaign for the Republican nomination to be president in 2016.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
The politicians can pretend it's something else, but Donald Trump calls it radical Islamic terrorism. That's why he's calling for a temporary shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until we can figure out what's going on. He'll quickly cut the head off ISIS and take their oil. And he'll stop illegal immigration by building a wall on our southern border that Mexico will pay for.
We will make America great again.
I think what I take away from this campaign ad is how central Trump made the idea of the imperial presidency to his run, for office in 2016. His very first campaign ad was really a distillation of the logic of the imperial presidency, putting forward this vision in which an unconstrained leader is necessary to protect the country from outside threats. So he's attacking other politicians who, he's saying that other politicians have these liberal sensibilities, which means they won't even use the term radical Islamic terrorism, but that he will be willing to use the full force of the presidency against America's enemies, against terrorists, against illegal immigrants, against criminals. And many of the promises that he made in the 2016 campaign can be viewed through this light, such as the building of the border wall with Mexico, and the Muslim ban, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. He said he was going to reintroduce torture for terrorism suspects, and then luckily after the election, the army talked him out of doing that. But so Trump really made this enthusiasm for the power of the imperial presidency central to his time in office. And I'm just going to talk now about, very quickly, three other things that kind of illustrate this. So the first example is the Muslim ban. Or the travel ban, as it was called. So as you know, shortly after Trump came into office, he imposed, it was one of the very first acts that his administration carried out. I think it was a week after the inauguration. He imposed a ban on the entry into the United States of citizens of, I think it was initially 7, but then they added 4 more countries later, from 7 Muslim majority countries. Now, Trump's campaign rhetoric, the things that he'd said during the campaign and in his first few weeks in office, made it really clear that he was doing this basically on the basis of religious discrimination. It was really clear violation of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, which prohibits a state religion or prohibits religious discrimination by the federal government. But when this went to the court, when the Muslim ban went before the court, it was eventually basically okayed. So the administration had to make some changes to it, but eventually the Supreme Court said, yeah, actually this is completely fine. And the reason that they gave for doing that is basically to say that whenever the president says that he's doing something on the basis of national security, it's not the place of the courts, it's not even the place of the Supreme Court to question that, because the president is the person who has the expertise, who has secret knowledge, and who has all the information at their fingertips to basically decide what is and what isn't good for the national security of the United States. And this is just kind of the latest example of a really, really long-running trend in American jurisprudence towards this kind of reasoning on the part of the judicial branch. But it's also the case that Trump's Muslim ban was actually foreshadowed by very similar decisions that the Obama administration made, but to place restrictions on the entrance of nationals from Libya, Somalia, and Yemen. Now, Obama did not act with the kind of religious animus which motivated Trump when he made the decision. But Obama had exercised the same right that the president has. It's now inherent in the office of the presidency due to it's written as the Immigration and Nationality Act, which allows the president to basically just shut down the entry of foreign nationals from particular countries. And this move by Obama was cited by the Supreme Court to say, what Trump has done is completely within the authority of the presidency. Second example I want to talk about is war powers. So, this came up a few times during Trump's presidency. So Trump famously launched cruise missiles at Syria. He famously ordered the assassination of a high-ranking Iranian military commander at the beginning of 2020. And then there was also this, some of you have maybe heard about this controversy surrounding Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley, who in the final few weeks that Trump was in office felt it necessary to go and talk to the kind of war controllers in the Pentagon and say to them, if you receive the order from Donald Trump to launch a nuclear weapon, then I don't want you to do that. I want you to come and check with me first. So this kind of, and he did this because Trump was perceived at this point to be unstable, acting so irrationally, and obviously acting with such extreme animus towards the American democratic process. So Milley did this just a day, I think, after the January 6th insurrection. So this issue was really a live one during the Trump administration. People basically saying Trump can't be trusted with the right to decide when the United States goes to war. But due to very long-running trends in American jurisprudence and then kind of how the Constitution has been interpreted, it's now become the case that it is actually the president who de facto makes the decision about whether the US should go to war or not. The last time that Congress declared war was in 1942, when Congress declared war on Romania as one of the Axis powers in World War II. But now this authority has just been given to the office of the presidency. And this was mainly something that came about during the Cold War, when it came to be believed by liberal internationalists, by the American foreign policy elite, that Congress was no longer reliable. Congress can no longer be trusted to basically exercise this responsibility with either the speed that was required in the nuclear age, or also just with they wouldn't reach the right decisions, basically. People looked at what happened in Congress in the 1930s and the big debates and, what was retrospectively seen as kind of congressional obstructionism to the US entering World War II or providing more aid to the Allies earlier, and they said Congress can't be trusted with this power. Now, what was really interesting during the Trump presidency was that actually exercising this power to carry out acts of war won Trump praise from the exact same people who were arguing that Trump was unstable and unsuitable to be in the office of the presidency. So, Fareed Zakaria, who is a CNN commentator, very, very famous, influential media pundit, had written an essay about how Trump's completely unsuitable to be president. We shouldn't have him as president. He can't be trusted with that authority. When Trump decided to launch cruise missiles at Syria, Zakaria suddenly started praising Trump and said, he said famously, this was the moment at which Donald Trump finally became president. So this really illustrates to me how, in the eyes of many liberal internationalists, the president carrying out functions like starting wars, carrying out acts of wars, is very, very much what they like to see in that institution. So much so that even though they didn't like Donald Trump, they praised him when he carried out this function of the office. And that, I think, really tells us something about the attitude of liberal internationalists to the imperial presidency and how supportive of it they are. Third one, which I'm just going to skip over really quickly, is the executive immunity from prosecution. So this enabled all kinds of shenanigans by Trump and the people around him during office, where basically the fact that the president cannot be indicted while he's in office, impeachment doesn't work anymore because Congress is so polarized. And this enabled all sorts of things that just didn't happen in previous administrations, things like the emoluments violations. So Trump's hotel in Washington, while he was president, was just completely full of foreign dignitaries all the time, using credit cards to put money straight into Donald Trump's pocket in an attempt to win favor with him. Now there's no one there. I'm told that the lobby of the Trump Hotel is just empty. No one wants to go there anymore. So tells you why they were there to begin with. Trump's phone call with Ukrainian leader Zelensky, the one which led to a second impeachment, but didn't lead to any kind of criminal prosecution, despite the fact he broke federal law when he tried to blackmail Ukraine into taking certain actions in order to receive aid that Congress had authorized for Ukraine. And so all of this kind of immunity, which I could cite many more examples, it's upheld by policy. Particularly the Department of Justice's decision that the president cannot be prosecuted while he's in office, but it's also supported by precedent. Gerald famously pardoned Richard Nixon. Barack Obama famously decided to carry out no prosecutions or even investigations into CIA officers and national security agency leaders who've been involved in breaking domestic and international law during the Bush administration. And this is even continuing with Biden, seeming to have made the decision that he's not going to pursue any kind of criminal charges, any kind of criminal cases against Donald Trump for the activities that he carried out while he was in office. So really my takeaways about the imperial presidency are to say that really the focus of critics is very, very misplaced here, I think. So liberal internationalists spent so much time criticizing Donald Trump as a man, but they didn't spend time rethinking their own prior commitments to the imperial presidency as an institution and rethinking these precedents and how they might need to be changed and how the imperial presidency might need to be reformed in order to prevent someone like Trump emerging again in the future, or someone worse than Trump. So they like the imperial presidency because they see it as necessary to defend America and to uphold the liberal international order, but they don't really have a satisfying answer to how you keep this phenomenal concentration of power out of the hands of Donald Trump, or like Donald Trump in the future. And I think that this deference to the imperial presidency is based on assumptions about executive branch leadership, which are just very, very misplaced in today's polarized age and with today's polarized politics. And when I look at the likely slate of candidates to be the next GOP nominee for president in 2024, then, if you do that, I think it's pretty easy to reach this conclusion. And so I really think that viewing Trump through these frames of Jacksonianism, about which I'm going to say more in a minute, or just viewing Trump as kind of an aberration and now he's gone, we can go back to business as usual, is really, really dangerous because we don't think about these potentialities in the presidency and how they're open to abuse in the future. So now I'm going to talk a little bit, and I think I have about 10 minutes left, about Trump, Biden, and foreign economic policy. And the continuities that I see here. So this isn't really so much about the imperial presidency, although I'll come back to that topic at the end, but it's another kind of fresh way of looking at the Trump administration and continuities and the problems and questions that they raise for us. So as I've mentioned a few times, but not really explained thoroughly yet, one of the dominant frames that we use for understanding Donald Trump is this concept of Jacksonianism, which was invented by Walter Russell Mead, the famous historian, in a book that he published. Well, he talked about Jacksonianism in an article that was published in the late 1990s, but then in 2001, he published a book, Special Providence, in which he talked a lot about this idea of a Jacksonian tradition of American foreign policy. And Mead basically says that Jacksonianism is a tradition of thinking about American foreign relations, which is very, very focused on the direct material interests of the American middle class, understood mostly but not exclusively as the white middle class and the working class in America. So a Jacksonian foreign policy outlook looks at every aspect of American foreign policy, and it's not interested in upholding, an abstract concept like the liberal international order, because it can't see how this directly benefits American citizens in their day-to-day life. So a Jacksonian approach to foreign relations is one that was often applied to Trump, someone who was very, very, critical and skeptical of international organizations because they were taking away America's sovereignty and kind of the democratic control of the American people. He was very, very skeptical of trade deals and an open international economy because he felt that Americans, workers were being ripped off and put out of jobs by trade deals. He was very opposed to, at least in 2016, he was very opposed to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan because he said, American soldiers shouldn't be going and dying in order to build democracy in foreign lands. How is that benefiting Americans here? How is it benefiting us at home? So this Jacksonian frame is I think, the dominant one through which we view the Trump administration, or at least many academics view the Trump administration. And it really places an emphasis on Trump as being aberrant, as the Jacksonian tradition is seen as kind of the black sheep of the family of American foreign policy traditions, not one that is very well represented among the foreign policy elite, not one that's very represented in most presidential administrations, but Trump was really seen as this kind of insurgent Jacksonian who's bringing this kind of outsider perspective to American foreign policy. And of course, if you know much about the history of the presidency of Andrew Jackson, then you'll recognize why we call this Jacksonian. Now, I have begun to question more and more the value of this framework, the value of this way of looking at things. And the reason that I've been doing that is because I've been looking at the Biden administration's foreign economic policy and not seeing a whole lot of difference between it and the Trump administration's foreign economic policy. And when you do that, you have to really start questioning this idea that Trump represented this kind of aberrant Jacksonian tradition that's somehow outside the mainstream of American foreign policy. One of the main organizing principles of Joe Biden's foreign policy is what he calls a foreign policy for the middle class, which basically aims to restore the faith of the American public in elite-guided internationalist foreign policy. So basically, the people around Biden look at Trump's election in 2016 and say American foreign policy has gone really badly wrong in terms of explaining itself and delivering benefits for ordinary people if people can go and vote for Donald Trump, because they don't realize how dangerous he is. So what we need to do is we need to restore the faith of the American middle class in an elite-guided internationalist foreign policy, basically, have them stop voting for people like Donald Trump, and we can all agree again that actually the blob and the establishment should be the people running American foreign policy again. So the idea behind Biden's economic policy is very different, but does it actually result in much of a different policy? I really don't think it does. If I look at Biden's foreign economic policy, I see at least four kind of main prongs to it. One, so Biden, just like Trump, has put basically a strategic pause on negotiation of any new trade deals. So he's not going to go rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's not looking closely at a US-UK free trade deal. He's not looking closely at a free trade deal with Taiwan, despite Taiwan asking for that and the obviously kind of geopolitical things that are going on there as well. Biden hasn't lifted the tariffs that were on Chinese goods when he entered office that Trump had put there. He's not lifted the tariffs on the European Union that were put in place by Trump for the very kind of spurious excuse that European steel exports were harmful to national security. There's that term, national security, again, against under which the modern presidency can carry out so many actions unilaterally. Biden hasn't chosen to change this framework that he inherited from Trump. Indeed, he's stepping up trade enforcement measures. So that's kind of using the provisions of existing treaties to hold other nations accountable for the ways in which they are alleged to cause economic harm to America through their economic and trade policy. Biden instituted a Buy American policy for the federal government, which basically means that the federal government will use its vast purchasing power to only buy American manufactured goods to support American domestic manufacturing. Biden is also pushing a global income tax reform, which is way too complicated to go into much detail now, but he's basically calling for a global minimum income tax rate, which is actually, although has many domestic benefits for Americans, has very bad consequences for American allies like Ireland, who kind of have based their economic model on much lower corporate income tax rates. So it's America first. He's putting America's interests first. Now, why has Biden done this? Now, it's not because there's a huge groundswell of public opposition in general to trade deals. In fact, Donald Trump had this fantastic power to turn the public at whole against any position that he held. And as you can see from this graph, large majorities of Americans think that trade is good for the US economy. They think it's good for consumers like themselves. They think it's good for their own standard of living and for American businesses. So there's not a great kind of clamoring among the American public at large for this kind of economic nationalist policy, but Biden's doing it anyway, and well, why is that? I think that we need to look at two sets of deeper trends that are driving economic nationalism across administrations. And once we look at these trends, we perhaps stop seeing Trump's economic policy as aberrant and as kind of representing this outsider tradition that just needed to be banished so that we could do something else and go back to openness. We're seeing a much more structural shift towards economic nationalism in American politics, not just Trump and the people around him. There's two reasons for that, which I'll talk about briefly. So one is the diffusion of economic power away from China and towards away from the United States and towards China. And the second is the emergence of trade as a big issue in electoral politics due to swing state geography. So as in a statistic that I often like to say to my students, because it kind of blows my mind every time that I say it, is that at the closing of World War II, 50% of the world's entire manufacturing output was produced in the United States. So the US is producing 50% of all of the manufactured goods in the entire world. And, so this kind of was a reflection of how competitive and efficient, the US economy was at this time, especially compared to the economies that had been devastated by the Second World War. But over time, as the US international economic position has eroded, the, economic openness and free trade has become much more difficult for Americans to stomach and to support. It imposes more costs at home when you're competing with more advanced and developed economies. So American companies in 1945 or in 1960, when the US in 1960 still represented 40% of the entire global economy, American companies didn't really have to worry too much about free trade at that point. They're not getting out competed by France or Germany or Italy or any of these other countries that they're competing with. But today that picture looks very different. So as America's international economic position has eroded, economic openness has started to harm American companies and harm certain subsets of American voters in ways that it just didn't before. It's also the case that as China's economy has grown and geopolitical competition with China has grown, trade is an easy way for administrations to impose costs on China to signal that they dislike Chinese behavior and try to force changes in Chinese behavior. You know, something that Daniel Dresner, other scholars of economic coercion talk about is that economic coercion is often the first tool that American policymakers reach for because it's low cost. It doesn't seem to have the risk of escalating. So the rise of China in two ways has really kind of shifted the geopolitics, the international politics of trade for the US. And this has really, you know, interacted at home with the primacy in presidential elections of certain swing states in the upper Midwest, where there's been a great loss of manufacturing employment and where voters are much, much more opposed to trade openness. So the American public as a whole remains supportive of trade openness, but the politics of particular swing states remains hostile to trade. And that's something that, you know, is just going to continue across various administrations. So my takeaways just on this piece, and I'm going to wrap up now, is that so foreign policy for the middle class and America First had very different goals, but very similar trade policy outcomes. And these are driven by structural changes in international and domestic politics that are driving and will continue to drive economic nationalism across administrations in the future. So it's not just about Trump, it's not just about Jacksonianism, it's about these deeper trends. Just want to really quickly offer a few overall conclusions then about what I call Biden's three continuities. The first is in the realm of the Imperial Presidency. So Trump was a warning about how the Imperial Presidency could be abused, but we really, you know, in our conversations about this, about what the Biden administration's actions, they remain focused on Trump, the man, as a danger, not the institution. Biden's continued competition with China, you know, which is something that has a great risk of escalation in the future. And he's also continued Trump's foreign economic policy. So thanks very much. Sorry that I talked for so long, but I'm really looking forward to getting some questions. Thanks very much.
Andy, thanks so much. I thought that was an absolutely superb presentation. And to be frank, I never really, prior to your talk, appreciated the utility of looking at the Trump presidency through the prism of the Imperial Presidency. But I think you definitely sold me on the importance of doing so. I think it was pretty much game, set, and match. So basically, for anybody who's interested, if you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat box, which you can find on the lower right-hand side. If you click on the icon with the two arrows, and once that opens up, if you just go to the icon on the lower left-hand side. Otherwise, you can raise your hand and we'll arrange for you to speak. Perhaps while we're waiting for a question or two, I can ask for your thoughts on something that's, I don't say bothering me, but I've been curious about for some time, essentially since, you know, going back to, for instance, November of 2016, just after Trump was elected. I mean, before he was elected, you remember sort of the outrage, this idea of how could this person even be considered a possible president of the United States, and you know what would happen if he actually did become president. And there's a great deal of emotion about you know, about this at the time, and I certainly remember that period very well. I drank quite a lot that evening, to say the least. But one thing that struck me was essentially the day after, and certainly the week after he got elected, was not so much the sort of internal American continuity, it was the foreign continuity, in the sense that rather than saying we're going to break off relations with the United States or form new alliances, or in the case of Europe, move to more strategic autonomy, to use that lovely term, and so forth, that quite the opposite happened, that actually most of these governments tried to establish relations with Trump more or less right away to maintain their continuity in relations with the United States. So I mean, you saw Macron within a few months inviting Trump over to Paris, later to go to the Bastille parade, and so on. The NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, doing everything that he could to cozy up to Trump and so forth. And I was just sort of wondering about your thoughts about not just sort of the internal aspects of trying to keep the Imperial Presidency or sort of American foreign policy on its old course, but also the foreign reactions to that there was also this interest in maintaining continuity as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I I think, you can say a couple of things about that. I mean, I think it's firstly a reflection of how important relations with America are to, most countries in the world, and that they didn't want to harm that relationship, just because Trump had been elected, because what America does is so important in their own politics and to their own international interests. I think especially when you had a president who was as unstable and mercurial as Trump was, both kind of personally, but also in the people that he surrounded himself with. So I remember that in the first year that Trump was in office, there were these different centers of power in the White House, one of them around Steve Bannon, one of them around Jared Kushner, and so on and so on. And we never really knew like what was going to come out of that White House, right? You never knew who had. Reminds me, Samuel Huntington said that the politics of the American presidency are like the politics of a medieval court, and it's all about kind of who's in favor or out of favor at a certain time. And that's true of all presidencies, but it was just so true of Trump's, and the volatility was so high that I think that foreign states maybe hoped that they could steer that in a constructive direction by acting in certain ways. And, that relationship with America was just too important for them to kind of, throw up their hands and say, we're going to walk away from this or kind of back down from this, because they would be worried about what Trump would do to them, and they would be worried about reinforcing in the position of the nationalists in the White House, perhaps. I also think that, one of the things that was kind of, and the more I look back on this and read kind of, journalistic accounts of it, was just the role that personality played in Trump's foreign policy, and particularly kind of the lack of institutionalization that exists in that, you had like Jared Kushner running American foreign policy towards the Middle East at the exact time that he's trying to get Qatar to invest and bail out his company back home. And there was just this level of like corruption and of things happening due to personal relationships that bore no relation to what was on the organization chart, that everybody, wanted to get close to Jared Kushner because that's going to allow them to get close to Donald Trump, right? And that matters much more than like Rex Tillerson or, I mean, one of the 20 national security advisors that Trump had. So, I think it was just that everyone was foreign countries are trying to game that system to see that their own interests are looked out for, and thinking, well, that's what we owe our voters back home. We have to make the best of this situation, and kind of, tantrums and drawing attention to how aberrant this presidency is not going to do for us. So in a way, it reminds me of the idea of exorbitant privilege that is often, said the US dollar as an international currency has exorbitant privilege. Americans can just keep printing it because everyone wants it. American power is kind of the same, I guess. There's an exorbitant privilege that Americans can misuse that power, but the rest of the world is still going to need them at the end of the day, and they have to accommodate themselves to it.
Yes, I mean, sort of on the point about the sort of the Kremlinology of the Trump White House, which I found absolutely fascinating to watch at the time. If you recall, I think it was Michael Wolff's book. I can't remember the title, but when he introduced the term Jarvanka, the Jarvanka faction in the White House versus the Steve Bannon faction in the White House, and then you get people like John Bolton showing up and all the rest of it. But I mean, when it comes to foreign countries, one thing that struck me as well was this notion that sort of behind the scenes, there was this belief that we can somehow ride out 4 years of Trump, but 8 years will probably be a bit too much. So for them, it was lucky, of course, that Trump was not reelected, but of course now we're dealing with a situation where he might actually come back. And I'm sort of wondering how that actually affects policies towards the United States and views about the United States, because obviously this is sort of the ultimate. At that point, is this sort of the end we've had it with the United States? So for Biden at the moment, it's really about trying to demonstrate that yes, there is a future with future maintaining good relations with the United States in a way that might otherwise not be as obvious with Trump.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point. That when and this was kind of, I think that's such a good point because, you know, it relates to the one that I'm trying to make about Trump as an aberration. You know, that I think that is how he was viewed when he was first elected. As you said, many foreign countries thought, okay, well, we'll have 4 years of him. He's obviously not going to get reelected, and then, you know, things will go back to normal. But he's wreaked such a transformation of American domestic politics that, you know, I just don't think that that assumption is any longer valid. And a return by him in 2024, I think will, yeah, you know, we'll have so many foreign governments asking questions about the United States, but I guess they run into this problem that we discussed in the last answer, that there's only so much that they can do about it ultimately, you know. And I think that that process of accommodating to, you know, a Trumpian US is quite disheartening to see.
Yeah, I mean, another question that I had, and I would certainly encourage other members who are other participants to ask some questions as well, has to do with this notion that sort of when does a new president's foreign policy really begin to take shape? Because I've noticed, certainly at the time of Trump, and looking at his transition between November and January, how he had a very hard time actually finding people to run his government. And this included, you know, cabinet level officials, ambassadors, and all the rest of it. But I gather that Biden has actually had the same problem, that actually very few of very few senior positions in this government have been appointed by Biden, that there's still quite a few holdovers, or at least people who presumably are apolitical, just taking over the job temporarily. So how hard is it actually to institute some sort of change under those circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, this has been one of the most striking things about the Biden administration for me that I just did not expect, which is that, you know, they are doing, I think, even worse than the Trump administration was at this point at getting senior officials appointed. And this to me kind of, you know, and this is kind of one piece of a jigsaw that forms a picture for me, which says that basically, you know, I just don't think the Biden administration is that focused on foreign policy. I think they came into office, you know, facing quite unprecedented domestic challenges, you know, with, you know, the economy, the coronavirus pandemic particularly, and that they've just been so focused on using this very, very, very narrow window that they have to try to pass transformational domestic legislation, and so many other things have fallen by the wayside. And, you know, I definitely wouldn't rule out the fact, you know, that we trend, I suppose it's a bit of a cliche, but we tend to see this pattern with American presidents that they inevitably lose their congressional majorities, or those get kind of whittled down the longer that they're in office, and they put much more attention into foreign policy, you know, later on in their terms. So I really think at the moment that the Biden administration has basically made this decision, you know, no big moves in foreign policy, just keep focused on domestic stuff, and later on we're going to maybe pivot to foreign policy and start making some changes. And yeah, the kind of real slowness at confirming officials just says to me that the administration and Congress are spending their time on other things. You know, and I think this might have contributed to the kind of chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan and a few other things that have happened as well.
So we have a question from Oscar Fernandez, and thank you very much, Oscar, for your question. He asked, do you see a fundamental difference between Trump and Biden's approach towards EU military self-reliance? Trump wanted EU countries to spend more on defense, but only so they could increase their purchases of US equipment. Do you think Biden is more open to a stronger and eventually more competitive EU defense industry?
Yeah, I think, you know, that's that's a good question. And I mean, it's always been the case throughout America's kind of history of dealing with the European Union as an entity, that they want Europe to take on more responsibility and to pay more, but they want to kind of remain strategic control of where those assets and where that activity gets channeled, right? And I think that that's just a fundamental thing that's going to continue under the Biden administration as well. You know, the Biden administration is caught between two imperatives, because on the one hand, it really wants to do things for the American defense industry, but it also really wants to see Europe stand on its on its feet again. So I think probably what the Biden administration and what any American administration would prefer would be that the EU spends more on defense, but hopefully they buy assets from the United States, and they can use the argument of interoperability to make that case that it's actually better if European countries are using equipment that integrates very well with the American military, because that makes joint operations easier. So I'm not sure that I do see a big difference between Trump and Biden's approach towards EU military self-reliance. I mean, Trump was, I don't think Biden's going to come out and kind of insult the leaders of NATO and threaten to, not stand by Article 5 if they don't spend more money on defense. But, Trump wasn't unique. And in fact, many of his predecessors had basically wanted the EU countries to do this. They just went about saying it more diplomatically. And I think with Biden, we see a return to that way of approaching the issue. And it's more a change of rhetoric and style than it is a substance, I would say.
If I could ask, I mean, to sort of go back, I can't remember the title of the book, but sometime I think it was in the late 1970s, maybe early 1980s, Chomsky wrote a book about the Carter administration and human rights policy, essentially making the argument that despite a lot of the rhetoric that Carter was using about promoting human rights and so forth, that actually fundamentally the U.S. hadn't really changed very much on that score. And I was sort of curious about your views. I mean, if there is perhaps one major distinction between Trump and Biden, is that Biden is sort of emphasizing this, emphasizing democracy and versus authoritarianism and this sort of rhetoric. But I think it's sometime in December there's a democracy summit that the White House has sort of talked a lot about, at least during the election period, and not much seemed to actually happen after Biden got elected. Are you expecting any big changes or any developments in December?
No, not really. And I mean, I think that the ship has the ship has already sailed for me on this. So I think that when Biden decided that he wasn't going to carry out any sort of reset in U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia, which is one of the kind of early foreign policy decisions that they made. This just kind of showed to me, that rhetoric about emphasizing human rights and democracy had very, very clear limits, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia tortured and dismembered an American resident, in an intelligence operation, and Biden's not even going to turn around, and seek sort of any kind of change in the relationship with the kingdom after that. And so I think that they for me, this rhetoric about democracy, was something that they found it tactically useful to focus on in 2020, because Trump, they were portraying very accurately, in my belief, Trump as a threat to American democracy at home. And so, emphasizing democracy in foreign policy, the idea that we're not going to have a leader anymore who aspires to be like Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin, this was a really good campaign line. But I think, the way that the Summit of Democracies has been dealt with after the election, basically it's been widely ridiculed, outside of the administration, and now it's kind of, relegated to this thing that's happening in December. And I'm sure that they will announce some multilateral initiatives and some kind of incremental steps on, I expect to see anti-corruption will be a big issue that they'll talk about probably. But I really don't think that this deserves to be viewed as an organizing principle of American foreign policy in the Biden administration.
Yes, I sort of see it as somewhat analogous to Obama's nuclear security summits, which more or less didn't achieve anything at all either. But anyway, they made a lot of, they garnered a lot of publicity, but not actually much happened. Well, look, as it's now 7 p.m., I'm afraid I will need to bring this session to a close. Andrew, thank you so much for a superb presentation, which I found, extremely informative. And I'm certain you've definitely given us a lot to think about on a number of different topics. So really, thank you so much. Before leaving, I would like to just briefly remind everyone that the next session in this series will take place next Tuesday, when Professor Bruce Gentleson of Duke University will be speaking about the Biden administration's foreign policies, sort of as a first-year assessment, but also looking forward through the remainder of his term in office. So I hopefully look forward to seeing you then, and wishing all of you a very pleasant remainder of the evening. Thank you. And thank you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.